Everybody, welcome to Moebius Studios. We're doing another Conan the Barbarian podcast. I've got some very special guests with me here today. First, I'll start with the guests that are in the room, and I have right here to my right,
Joeseph Simon.
And to my left,
Wally Monk.
And on a special phone line, I've got
Bob Freeman.
Bob Freeman. All right. So, I guess we're going to start off by talking about the brand new Conan the Barbarian relaunch, as we want to call it. And let's just get into it. Let's just talk about Conan the Barbarian issue number 1. What are some of our thoughts here on Conan the Barbarian number 1? Bob, do you want to start?
First, I had high hopes for the book. I'm a big fan of Jason Aaron's. And I thought that he had covered Thor pretty well, Doctor Strange pretty well. So I thought he was a natural fit for Conan. Unfortunately, for me, it just missed the mark. I didn't think that Aaron really captured the character as Howard wrote him. I'm somewhat of a Robert E. Howard purist, so yeah, I found it, especially out of the gate, just a little disconcerting, but I still had hope that would, shortly thereafter be dashed against the rocks, but we can get to that later. So,
Joeseph, what did you think of Conan the Barbarian number 1?
Well, I also agree that the writer is very good, and I've liked what he's done on Thor and Doctor Strange. I'm curious, Bob, do you think he captured Thor properly?
At times, yes.
So do you think he might have a problem with capturing characters? Or more so, he is his own writer and does his own thing?
I think he does his own thing, but I thought he was respectful to Thor and Doctor Strange. I was expecting the same thing with Conan, and I think in his mind he is being respectful. I think he just interprets the character perhaps differently than some of the rest of us do.
I would agree with that.
Well, at least one person left here. What did you think, Wally?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it started at the top of the hill, and we're watching the sled go very rapidly downhill. I thought the first issue had some promise. I was really impressed with the pastiches they had that took a look at the classic Conan issues, and I thought we were going to see a little more respect for the character as Howard intended it.
Right.
I've had some major issues with some of the dialogue, more so in Savage Sword than in the regular Conan series. But it seems like each issue, with the exception of number two was very good. But this last issue, wow, I don't know what they're trying to do with Conan, and it worries me a little bit. But I'm not as familiar with the contemporary comic writers as Joeseph and Bob are, so the work of these writers is new to me. So
what did you think was the theme of the 4th issue of Conan the Barbarian, as you said before?
Conan number 4 was Conan becomes Moon Knight. He dons a little mask and goes out into the streets of Aquilonia at night to fight crime. I thought it was beyond ludicrous. But again, I'm looking at the classic material, the old stuff that people like myself really enjoyed, and that's not the Conan that I know.
I couldn't agree with that statement more.
I thought the mask itself reminded me of him like them attempting to make him like a Punisher type character.
Right.
Yes.
And I guess maybe that would that tie into the new Avengers? Is that where this is? Where they're trying to maybe segue this into the Avengers kind of thing? I mean, we haven't seen it yet, so we don't know.
Oh, I hope not.
On our way here, we actually joked about that.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. That once he's on the Avengers, he's going to see other people in masks and be like, "Oh, I'm going to pull this out."
To me, when I saw Conan in his skull mask, I thought it was representative of the recent work Walt Simonson has been doing with the undead Thor, Are any of you familiar with that?
No.
I think the book's called Ragnarok.
No.
I'm sorry, no.
Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, so Walt Simonson, most famous for, his Marvel Thor run. So Ragnarok has happened, and Thor is dead, and he's a skeleton, right? But in his full Thor regalia, and so it looks just like what that guy was drawing.
Is this a Marvel comic, or is this a...
It is not, no.
Okay. I am familiar with this a little bit.
Sounds like something worth picking up at some point.
It's beautiful.
It's at Half Price Books.
Oh my goodness!
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, I've seen it at Half Price Books.
It's a comic book?
I saw the trade collection.
Oh, okay.
Bob, I'll have to get the details from you later on where to pick that up and where I need to look. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I learned about it from following Walt on Twitter, so he posts a lot of art from it, and on his Facebook page also. So
excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
So going back to the Life and Death of Conan Part 1, I'm not that familiar with the older comic books. I read more Savage Sword than I did Conan the Barbarian. So in the pit fighting sequence, Conan loses his sword in a drunken stupor. Is this normal behavior for the old Conan? Like, are they adding a new layer to Conan, or is this something that we've seen before? Is this regular canon? Is what I guess I'm getting at. Like, is this a standard behavior from Conan?
Well, Conan as a pit fighter comes from the Arnold Schwarzenegger film.
Okay.
Him getting in a drunken stupor, that's a common trope, even with Howard. So
okay, but losing his sword, what about that?
It's ironic.
Is it supposed to be funny?
Well, no. In fact, I'm working on a review of an issue of Conan where that's the case. In the course of the action, he grabs onto a giant monster, and in order to hold onto the monster, the sword goes by the wayside. I know there are other instances where he's misplaced his blade or whatever the case may be. So it's been seen before.
It's not something new. Is the character Almighty Razazel? I don't know how to say that, but
right, yeah, that's not something that's canon. That's something that Aaron's come up with on his own. I really don't mind that part so much. Yeah, that's it's a good framing device for I think what he had planned for his 12 issue arc. But I think it's getting away from him a little bit. But
it'll be interesting to see how he ties all these issues together because really the first 4 have been all over the map. We had the Picts and the giant snakes in issue 2. In the first issue, we had the tale of the woman who was actually the demon. In issue 4, we had Conan the Vigilante. So I really have no idea how he's going to tie this all together. It'll be kind of interesting to see.
Is this supposed to be like a limited series, or is this going to be like a continuing series? Because I know, like right off the bat, they say, they talk about the death of Conan, and this is how he lived. Like,
well, it's from different points in his timeline.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's any limit to the series, or even if there's a plan with the upcoming.
I think it's just a 12-point story arc, if I'm not mistaken. I think this is an ongoing series, but. Somehow we're going to see this Life and Death of Conan storyline resolved by issue 12, or at least that's the hope, I would imagine.
Correct, and then another writer and artist will come on board and tell another arc. So, at least that's the plan.
Well, let's hope we don't see any more of Conan in the Punisher mask.
Right now, switching it over to Savage Sword. Now their arcs are shorter. I think this first arc is 5 issues. Is that if I remember correctly?
That's right. Yes.
So that's good because we'll get more of a turnaround. You can stomach a lot more. And then just speaking of that comic, I really did not care for the initial issue of it, but the second issue I liked a lot. So.
Now, is the character that's in the second issue the Kogathon, the sorcerer? Is that a new character, or is that something that's appeared?
That's a new character.
Okay.
Yes. So, but yeah, that was an instance where I think the author he kind of Conan was mischaracterized in that first issue. I didn't think that he acted in any way, shape, or form like any version of Conan I had read before. But the Conan that appears in the second issue seemed, I was pretty good with. That seemed very Howard-like. So the dialogue's still a little rough, but at least the story seems to be writing itself. So.
Yeah, I would agree with you that second issue of Savage Sword was very good. I enjoyed that too. The first issue had me terrified, and again, I'm not quite the Howard purist that many individuals are. I've always been a fan of the classic Marvel Comics. That's where my Conan history really comes into play. But little glaring errors. I'm certainly not a perfect editor, and I know I've made my share of mistakes on our blog. But when you see Conan and you're thinking, wow, these pirates are right out of Pirates of the Caribbean. What's going on? The first question is, did this writer even read the source material? And if he did, where is the editor? So that was my first question. And a lot of people have excused the one panel where the captain or one of the pirates is holding or has in his belt a black powder weapon.
Right.
That to me just screams, I'm an editor and I didn't look at the artwork. That bothered me a lot. I mean, the story was still okay, but little things like that, I think, are something that editorial has a responsibility to catch.
Right, and we saw that, I think, in issue 4. I actually have been debating this online with several people, where on the very first page, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I don't remember how the former king of Aquilonia's name is pronounced, but I knew it looked wrong to me, spelled Namedes, Namedes, perhaps, but I remembered it differently. I went and pulled out The Coming of Conan, looked up the story, found, and it was spelled Numedes. And so then as people were saying, well, Howard had actually used that spelling himself. But I'm checking all my other sources, and it seems like they've all corrected that where Howard had made those errors. And that error, if you want to call it an error, because Howard wrote it, but these were on drafts that were never published. And I'm a writer myself, and if you go through the different drafts of books that I've written, I misspell my own characters' names all the time. So I think that's just him writing in a flurry, as he was wont to do, and him just not remembering how he had spelled it originally. So is it a mistake? I don't know. A good editor, I think, would have corrected it. Mm-hmm. And it just, especially on page 1, and it just slid right by him. So
right. I totally agree.
Considering this issue has 5 different editors, it is surprising.
Yeah. How does that work?
That's not good.
Maybe each one of them had a different page and none of them talked.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see where they go. At this point, I think I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I know that in my mind the alarm bells are going off. We're looking at this Avengers crossover. We've got Conan wearing a Punisher mask, running through the streets at night, with his lion partner. To me, it's just troublesome, and if that makes me old, I suppose it's because I am. But something is just wrong with that picture.
And we're already talking about his death. On top of that.
Yeah, no.
It's interesting that, I spend most of my time hanging out with a guy who is an old letterpress printer, and he's 89 years old. So I spend most of my days feeling quite young, and until I start delving into comics, and then suddenly I feel as crotchety and old as that printer that I hang out with. So.
I can relate to that, Bob. I can relate to that. I often think the same thing. I look at the comic rack and I look at the material out there and I say, either I'm out of touch or I just have a different idea about, what the industry was or should be like.
Well, I mean, if you're of a certain age, I'm in my mid-50s. So when I started reading comics, they were, 15 cents. And I lived in a very small rural community here in Indiana, and I lived on a farm. And I would hop the train, just jumping on the back of it and riding it into the nearest town, and I would pick up pop bottles on my way to the little soda shop. And I would trade in those bottles and get like 10 comics.
Nice.
And so I was cutting my teeth on like, Neil Adams and John Buscema and just all these great classic artists. And I'm just not seeing that today, what I saw then. And I don't think it's because I'm old. I think it's just the industry has diluted itself, and you're not getting the quality of creators that you once had because they're all being pulled into other media. And, the money's not where, it used to be. And, more's the pity for it. And all this is because of as soon as comic books moved out of the supermarkets and gas stations and into the direct market and, comic book stores exclusively, well, that was kind of the death knell that was sounded for the industry and why we're in the position we're in now.
Absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that, Bob. I was at the comic shop today picking up Conan #4, and I made the remark to the cashier. I said, "Boy, we've come a long way from still only 35 cents, haven't we?"
Jeez, yeah.
Right. I can remember vividly when it went. I wasn't so upset when they went to a quarter, but when they went to 35 cents, that was like, that hurt. That stung. A quarter, that's 4 bits, man. A buck could get you 4 books, and then all of a sudden, oh wait, they're killing me here.
Now you only get 3.
Right.
$3.99 an issue.
Yeah.
That's pretty high.
That's a lot. Well, and it's funny because it's almost the same price as collecting the trades. I've noticed that a lot of titles that I read that, are obviously not Conan yet, but it's so much easier just to wait instead of spending $4 or $5 on a comic, to wait until the trade shows up on sale and you get the same issues in a nice bookshelf format for $10 or $15. So, the industry certainly has its challenges, I think.
I would agree.
And another part of the problem is decompression, which is, it used to be that one comic that you bought, had this full, rich story in it, and now you've got to get 3 or 4 issues to tell the same story they used to tell in one.
Right.
It's a lot of talking heads anymore. And you even see that even in a Conan book, you're seeing a lot of talking heads.
Well, in the classic Conan books, it was amazing. Every single issue of Conan was a separate story. You could go from page 1 to 24, and in a 24-issue book, Conan will have traveled halfway across Stygia and, defeated a dragon and grabbed a jewel and taken the jewel back to the king. And now, you're lucky if Conan crosses the room and fights the villain before the end of the comic. So absolutely.
Yeah, I did notice that there was not a whole lot of story to the whole issue.
Right.
Or each issue that I read.
Right. Now, when you get that trade that collects the whole thing, it might read better. But being doled out, every month or every couple of weeks, depending on their whim, it's rough. It's you're sitting there just kind of chomping, and it's like that with just almost every comic that I read these days. It's the same thing. You're sitting there, you finish the book, and it feels empty. But I go pull one off the shelf, and I can read it and I'm satisfied.
Right.
One story in A Savage Sword, a classic with Buscema and Alcala artwork.
Yeah.
And you finish that and you're like, you sit back and you're like, yes, that was a ride. That's Roy Thomas knew how to write a story. There's no,
Oh yeah.
He had a command of the format.
Well, and Savage Sword was amazing. I mean, that was
agreed.
That was a phenomenal title that Especially for the first 100 issues. That was, definitely a highlight. You got the more mature Conan. You got, quality storytelling, no restrictions from the Comics Code, and
Right.
really the best possible artwork that you could get representing the Cimmerian and his world.
Yeah, it was
Agreed.
so titillating. Yeah, it was. As a kid, a young kid, I mean, that just was everything. It was just beautiful, just a beautiful piece of art.
So show of hands, who around here was hoping that Savage Sword, when Marvel announced it, would be a black and white, oversized magazine?
I was hoping.
My hand
I
is
was
up.
Absolutely, yeah.
My hand is
Yep.
raised.
Yeah, without question.
Oh, that would have been glorious.
But who would you have gotten to draw it? Who out there today? That there lies the rub. It's who could pull that off. Tom Grinsberg, yeah, he would do beautiful work, but could they afford him? Would they even talk to him? I don't know.
Tim Truman could do it. His black and white work is pretty good.
Yeah, I love Truman. When they did thing, I'm trying to remember Wolves of the Border, King Conan. God, that comic was so gorgeous. Tomas was the guy working on that with him.
I think I remember that.
Yeah.
That's the one you sent me the link to, right, Bob?
Right.
Okay.
I will. Yeah. A lot of the early Dark Horse was really brilliant. I was thrilled when they got the license, and it seemed like classic Marvel. They had good artists, decent writing, and then as happens, they began to fade at the end, and it was time for them for the license to go somewhere else. It's just, unfortunately, I don't think Marvel's doing it justice.
No, I agree.
Well, in addition to Tim Truman, I think P. Craig Russell, Michael Gilbert, and I'm sure there's others that would do a great job on a black and white magazine.
I didn't think about P. Craig Russell. He'd be a good
Yeah,
match.
I mean he's of an age, but he's still got the chops. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't mind seeing Neil Adams take another stab at it.
That would be good.
There's a lot of classic artists that don't get as much work anymore that I would love to see them, kind of pull out of semi-retirement.
Sure.
Do we want to talk about the past mistakes that Marvel made over the Conan series, either Barbarian or Savage Sword? And do we see a worry that maybe some of these mistakes are going to be repeated again with this new series we've got right now?
I think you're already seeing mistakes being made that
Obviously, with
that are
editing.
problematic, but that leads to and just to throw it out there also, I think there's a divide, like we'd mentioned, between new readers looking at Conan and people like us who grew up with Conan.
Right.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
There is a definite divide between younger readers and older readers, but what that divide is, I'm not sure. The opinions are out there for sure,
Right.
but
Well,
it hasn't been.
They've been raised on this decompressed storytelling, so it's not as jarring to them, I think, as it is for us, because they've kind of been weaned on it, and they're more apt to just take what they're given. It seems like, because they don't know any better.
Right.
It almost seems like there's a disdain for what was. It's almost like, okay, well, you thought Conan was good this way, but you know what? We're not your generation. We're the new generation, and we don't care what you're giving us. This is how we want to see it done. And I think that goes both ways. I think there are guys like us. Hopefully, I'm not one of them, but older readers who say, all this new comic stuff is garbage. And I really don't think there's a meeting of the minds there. I think on one end, there's not a whole lot of respect for the history of the comics. And on the other end, you have a lot of, and I don't think any of us here fall into this category, but I think you have people who say, well, this is the way comics were and this is the way they always should be. And I really think that all the way around in the industry, that there could be more of a meeting of minds. People saying, okay, let's respect the history, but let's give this a try. Instead of just the judgment that's so prevalent, now, where people just jump to conclusions. Well, I don't like this, so it's bad. I don't know. Does that make sense to anybody? Or
it perfectly does. I've been reading comics for 45 years or more, and I read just as many today as I did, when I started. I think I have a pretty good feel for the industry as a whole, from those early days to now. And I think a big difference is when I was young, I was reading comics, from a decade before, and it was seamless. And I've kind of talked about this, about how comics, a title is like a sandbox that you get to play in. And Wally and I were kind of talking about this earlier today. And back in the 70s and 80s, artists and writers knew how to play in the play box or in the sandbox and not break the toys. And I think at some point, it became they purposely went in, and we're going to break this toy on purpose, and just shake things up. And for 50, 60 years before that, everybody was able to play together. And when you left a title, you were leaving the toys in place for the next guy to get in there and play with. And you're just not seeing that now. There's a general disrespect by creators, I think, in a lot of instances, for the characters. They come in wanting to tell their story, and they don't want to tell the best Captain America story they can. They want to tell this story, and they're just going to shoehorn Captain America into it. And maybe that's where the problem is.
Yeah, and Bob, I'm still stealing that quote from you for my editorial.
It's all yours.
Thank you.
Well, it goes back to editorial too, not your editorial, but it goes back to Marvel editorial for letting this all happen. Is it editorial mandate? Is it the writers deciding to do things like this? With Marvel, they have retreats where they plan out things far in advance, sometimes years in advance, as to what the Marvel Universe is going to do. So is it the writer or is it the company?
I think it's a little of both. Right, because the company is choosing the writers, right? So they're getting the people they want to work on the books that kind of fit into their editorial fiat. And I think you go back to when Marvel started shaking things up and they started bringing in people from independent comics, right? Instead of looking in-house like they had in times past, they looked to the people in the indie scene and brought them in to shake things up. And they come in with a different sensibility. And I think that's what's been going on with Marvel since then.
Well, now people work for Marvel and DC to get a fan base, and they leave with that fan base and do their own thing.
Yes, that's very true.
But when they have these retreats where they plan out what's happening with Marvel for a year or so, there is a lot of editorial oversight during these retreats. So I have to imagine that it's more the company than the creator.
Marvel's always had major problems with their editorial department. You hear the speculation that Marvel's entirely money driven now that they're owned by Disney. I don't know if that's accurate or if that's speculation, but my point is, editorial's been straight. There's a saying in the writing industry, and I'm sure you've heard this too, Bob, is nothing is so well written that a good editor can't screw it up. And you go back to the 80s when Marvel had a very new Khazar series, a savage kind of like Conan, and in an interview with one of the creative team members, this issue was doing tremendously well, And editorial made a decision to do a direct market test where they took the Khazar comic, Micronauts, and Moon Knight, and they yanked them out of the convenience stores and everywhere else and made them direct sales only. Well, and it destroyed Khazar. From what I understand, the other two titles were affected differently, but we had the potential for a Savage type comic in a dinosaur populated world to be a hit. But Marvel editorial said no, it's got to be part of the mainstream Marvel universe. We're gonna shut down this world that's been created. So Marvel's got a history of taking great properties, things that people really enjoy, and saying, well, no, we're not going to do that. And what the reasoning is behind it, I have no idea. But in that way, I can't really understand the reasoning here with Conan, because they've got an established fan base. You've got people who've been reading Howard since the 30s. And in this era of nostalgia, you've got people who are even in their 50s, 60s, 70s who would say, oh, hey, I remember Conan. I read that when I was 30. He's got a new comic book. I'm going to pick it up. It might be a stretch, and they're completely alienating that audience in a lot of ways, to go with, well, Conan should be this. And I think it's an editorial problem because, like Joeseph said and like Bob said, editorial does guide the writers. And if this is the fact with the Conan we're seeing, the editors really need to take a hard look in the mirror and a hard look at their fan base.
See, going back to editorial, we have the Howard books as like a Bible. So right. there should obviously be a Conan Bible for them to write from. And editorial should definitely know what that is, as well as the writers.
Right. Conan is not generic fantasy, which is kind of what we're getting from them now. The sword and sorcery genre, which Howard created, has a different sensibility, and I just think these guys. I think in Jason Aaron's case, because he's the one I've read the most. I think in his case, he was a big fan of the books, and I think he just buckled under the pressure of it, really. And I think he was trying to leave his mark. Instead of telling a good Conan tale, I think he was like, this is my chance to leave my stamp on the character. And that's not the way you approach it, in my opinion.
Totally agree. If you've had enough of the new Conan for a while and are interested in reading some of the classic Marvel goodness, my blog, Paint Monk's Library, will be relaunching the countdown to Conan. We had to stop back in November due to some obligations that I had. I needed to get some editorial assistance because my vocation is my priority, as we talked about. So I have a couple associate editors here that are helping out, a copy editor. You'll be able to read both Bob, Andy, Troy, Joeseph, and myself jumping back into those reviews. So the countdown will relaunch the same day that that people get the opportunity to hear this podcast. So we'll be picking up with issue 75 and hopefully going all the way to issue 275.
Wow.
So.
And that Conan run that we're viewing right now is the highlight, the benchmark for which all Conan comics have to be weighed against. This Roy Thomas's run through here, his adaptation of the Queen of the Black Coast, it's just a beautiful thing. It's just a beautiful work of art. And it's going to be sad when Roy leaves the book, because then that's when we start having the same kind of problems we're seeing now in modern Marvel, and maybe that's it. Maybe it was Roy. It's, when we look back and say, oh, well, this is when comics were good. This is when Conan comics were great. His name was always on it, either as an editor or as a writer.
That's a good point, Bob. That's a really good point.
The book was less successful whenever anybody else was touching it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think maybe we're all just Roy Thomas fans. Miss you, Roy. Hurry back.
Where is he?
He's around. Yeah. I'm reading the Barbarian Life right now, which is his recollection of his entire run with Marvel. He's going issue by issue, and it's great. It's a great insight. I recommend it highly.
I hope to pick that up at some point too, and we'll also just a heads up to everyone too. In addition to the classic Conan countdown, Bob here will continue covering the new issues of Conan, and our blogger Troy Chrisman will be covering Savage Sword. It's not really in line with Marvel Conan, but Bob is also covering the Red Sonja, the Roy Thomas created Conan-esque character from Dynamite. So you'll get to read not only Bob's countdown reviews, but those two. Joeseph will be helping with a number of different projects as well as the countdown reviews. And we're just going to keep moving forward, hopefully with the support of the readers that have graciously been reading.
We suffer so you don't have to.
That's right. If we rate it a 5 or below, you don't need to read it. Just go on to the next review. Did you see where Arnold Schwarzenegger was talking at a convention about the reason that the King Conan movie's never been made?
Why is that?
Well, I believe he said that they get the property, they sit on it, they look for the right monetary deal, and that's the reason it hasn't been done. The right players, so to speak, haven't really come into play. He hinted at Netflix and Hulu both having potentially turned down the opportunity. Excuse me, Netflix and Amazon potentially turning down the opportunity to do the Conan movie or a show. So
with him?
Just in general.
Oh, just in general?
And I know he's really clamoring to do King Conan. He's been talking about it a lot between that and the little internet thing that he did where he was reading the issue of Conan. So I think he's all for it. It's just a matter of, unfortunately, the money trail and where that leads.
Yeah, he kind of threw Cabinet Entertainment under the bus on that.
Yeah, a little bit. I caught that too.
But look, I'm not like most Conan fans that you'll run into, especially of people that are between 40 and 50 years of age. I didn't like the Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I went to the theater on opening night, and when the credits rolled, I stood up and booed.
Oh wow!
That was so far removed from anything Howard ever wrote. I was just appalled by it. Was it a great fantasy movie? It sure was. It's just, for me to rewatch it, I have to pretend it's somebody else. That's not Conan on the screen. It's a great movie, but it's not Conan. And
I could see where you could feel that way, Bob. I don't know you well, but from some of the correspondence we've shared, I know you really like Howard's literary works. You have a lot of respect for the history that he's built. With me having primarily a comic book background, it was just great seeing a Barbarian up there, seeing familiar characters. The fantastic soundtrack by Polydorus. Just having a fantasy movie that, really so many other fantasy movies, really they try to stack up to that first Conan film. Whether it's a Conan film or just a great fantasy Barbarian film. So I'll have to disagree with you on that. For my part, I loved it, but I can see as a Howard purist where it would have been problematic to you.
Yeah, and I watched all those Barbarian pictures in the 80s.
Oh, there were some bad ones.
Deathstalkers. And,
Deathstalker, yes.
Oh, those were terrible.
The Sword and the Sorcerer.
Ator, the Fighting Eagle.
Sword and the Sorcerer was a better Conan movie than Conan was.
Sword and the Sorcerer, I could never get past that 3-pronged sword with the rocket blades.
I had a friend who edited all the rocket blade scenes out of the movie.
Oh, nice.
And it was so much better, yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, that sword was terrible, but as a script, as a story, I thought they were much more faithful to the Howard. Talon was so much more like Conan than Conan was, but so
I'll have to watch that again now.
There was a whole slew of those. What about the Red Sonja movie?
Oh, please. Bridget Nielsen as Red Sonja?
Yeah, that was
weird. That was weird.
That was bad.
Bad as being kind. That movie, You know, that should have gotten 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. That was just,
Yeah.
that was painful.
Then there was the David Carradine movie. Did you catch that? Where let's see, what was it called?
The Warrior and the Sorceress.
That's it. Yes. Man, they put out a lot of direct back then.
Yes. Hey, did you get to enjoy any of these movies, Joseph or Keith?
Yes.
No.
My dad was obsessed with these types of movies back in the 80s, so he took me to see Conan, and that was my first introduction to Conan the Barbarian. So for me, I love the movie because it's like that's my first like gateway into the world of Conan. Like
Right.
eventually I read the books, but it was that first movie that like got me so interested in who Conan was and what it was all about. So
You know, that's an interest. If you don't mind, guys, I'd like to ask you, Keith, and I know this is your show, but if you don't
No,
mind,
that's fine.
You know, you said that the movie was your first exposure to
Yeah.
Conan. So, you know, just like Bob has said, you know, he grew up with the books, and therefore the movie was not, you know, true to the books. With you having started with the movie first and then gone back and looked at the books and the comics, how did that color how you looked at everything? How did Conan appear in those books and comics to the one that you love so much in the movie?
Well, there is a stark difference, and I think that like with most things that you read, it adds like extra layers because a movie can't really give you everything that like a novelization can.
Right.
And I after reading like a lot of the Conan books, I just reread some of them for the last podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that you can really give that kind of Conan on screen. I don't know if that's all that way possible. Like with as much magical things that are happening in the books and everything like that. I don't know that it like in '82 if that was even possible to make the books into a movie. I don't know. I don't know
Right,
how.
but
I don't know how
for
interesting
me,
it would have
the
been.
disconnect there was that Conan was intelligent.
Right.
He was taller than everybody else, but he was like as spry as a panther, you know. And Arnold is a lot of things, but smart and spry were not among them. That's why I really like Jason Momoa's portrayal of Conan. It was a terrible movie, but I thought Momoa was perfectly cast and he was Conan on screen. He just didn't have a script to help him out.
Yeah, after I saw Momoa as Khal Drogo in Game of Thrones, I knew that he'd be a good, you know, I knew before. I actually saw the Conan movie later, you know, years after it came out, and
Yeah.
I'd seen him as Khal Drogo before. And when somebody said, "Oh yeah, Jason Momoa's in Conan," I said, "Oh, I got to see that now." And I didn't like it either, but yeah, you're right. He was a good Conan.
What do you think, Joseph?
I liked both movies, as I mentioned in the last podcast. My comments were on the other movies that you guys were talking about, and the operative word is enjoy those.
It's hard to enjoy movies like Ator the Fighting Eagle. Those were just rough. They were
Beastmaster. That was another good one.
I like the ferrets in the pouch though. Those little ferrets that he had that he took everywhere. Yeah. Boy,
What
we're really.
about, have you guys seen Fire and Ice?
Yes.
Oh yeah, a long time ago.
That was a good one.
Yeah, that's
A lot of these are on Blu-ray. A lot of these are available on Blu-ray. I think Shout Factory put out some of these movies.
Well, I think, you know, arguably Frazetta is the person who put Conan on the map.
Right.
If he hadn't covered those original paperbacks, I don't think we'd be talking about him today. I mean, that's what attracted Roy Thomas to the character, you know, and he, you know, it was those covers. So, yeah, we would not be having this discussion if it weren't for Frank.
Yeah, Frank was instrumental, but it's interesting, you know, there were so many things that lined up, you know, to make Conan the Barbarian the success that it is. You know, you look at the Frank Frazetta covers on the Lynn Carter books or the L. Sprague de Camp books or whatever the case may be. And then you look at the history at Marvel where, you know, Stan Lee, if I'm not mistaken, wanted to license Thongor. You know, they were going to go after Lynn Carter's Thongor, which is, I think he's the king of Lemuria or something. I don't know. He's a Conan knockoff, effectively, or a Kull knockoff. Well, they wanted too much. Lynn Carter's agent wanted too much. So they went and they offered $50 more to the Howard folks And I think, was it Glenn Lord at that time? I'm not sure. But
It was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Glenn.
Okay, but yeah, they offered, I think it was $200 or $250, and they wound up with Conan. And really, from the success of the Marvel comic, you started seeing, Atlas came out with Wolf the Barbarian. You saw eventually Thongor come into Creatures on the Loose. So, Frazetta art, Elsprig de Camp, whether you love him or hate him, bringing some of these works back to light. Marvel getting Conan instead of Thongor. It's like all the stars aligned perfectly for Conan to become a success.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, what's interesting is, what is success today? What was success back then were sales, but today it's a multimedia world. So you're looking at success being movies, animation, and other things. And I think that's one of the things when we were discussing what's kind of wrong with comics today is there's a different standard for success. Back when Roy Thomas was on the title, it was and Stan Lee was running the show. It was not a profit-driven company as it is now, answering to a corporation and trying to meet specific standards.
Disney standards, right?
Correct.
So who's behind the scenes here? Who's controlling this story arc here? Who do you think has a big hand in this? Do you think Disney is saying anything? Because we're going to do Conan and the Avengers. Do you think we're going to eventually see Conan appear in one of these Avengers movies?
Oh,
I couldn't.
Hope not.
No, the right, they would have to get the movie rights, which are controlled elsewhere. So yeah, what you're going to run into is the same thing, because eventually the Conan license will go somewhere else. I'm pretty sure of that. And when that happens, that event, unless they sign some kind of deal, when that Avengers Coming Home arc won't be able to be published because of Conan's appearance in it.
Yep.
Or they won't put in whatever issues he's in. They'll remove his parts because that's you get that with other licensed properties where they can't publish things. I'm trying to remember now.
Well, it was the Micronauts and ROM for Marvel.
Yeah, right. So you
Star Wars
and Star Wars.
You can't do any of that stuff. So.
Shameless plug for Paint Monk's Library here on our blog. Joeseph actually, the thing that Bob is referencing here, Joeseph wrote a pretty lengthy commentary on, Marvel not having learned its lesson with licensed characters. And just like Bob is explaining here, you're running into problems. If they lose that Robert E. Howard license, you suddenly have an entire crossover arc of comic books that are never going to be collected in a trade, that are never going to be republished unless they can negotiate something.
Now people have been contesting that online because they're saying that Conan's going to fall in public domain at some point in
2031 or 2030, I think.
Something along those lines. There is
a ways away.
It is a ways away, and there is also a trademark that they have to deal with, and there are also ways for people to, and Disney knows this, avoid copyright laws and retain things.
Well, yeah, there's an excellent run of Conan comics in France
right
now, because in France
it's in the public domain.
All of Robert E. Howard is public domain.
Yeah.
So they can publish that stuff in Europe that they can't publish here. And so when Cabinet, when they have the rights to Conan, they only have the rights to Conan here in America.
Yeah. And sadly, what the French are doing, not that I read French, but it appears to be a lot better than what we're getting here from Marvel.
I was just gonna say that they're doing editions. They're doing re-releases of Queen of the Black Coast. One of their first releases was a remake of Tower of the Elephant. And we're getting this this material, and I'll just say this material that we're getting from Marvel.
Yeah, it's true. And I've actually read a couple of the French comics, the translations, which you can read them online.
Oh, really?
And they're quite good.
I was
Yeah,
just gonna. I was just gonna ask that if anyone's translated these. Okay.
yeah. So there's a couple of issues. There's a website that publishes new comics online. You can't download them, but you can read them on the screen. And so I did. I don't know how legal that is, but I guess they're a foreign market. But it's easy enough to find on the internet.
Yeah.
I would much rather the money flow to the creators, but
There you go.
In this age of the internet, it's amazing. Google has become a verb.
right.
Well, what are your thoughts with Conan and him joining the Marvel universe?
The mainstream Marvel universe.
Jesus.
I'm appalled by it. There's no place in it. I'm usually, there are certain characters that I don't think should ever play, with the mainstream comics. Another of my favorite comics is Hellblazer. John Constantine, right? That's a character that should never play with Batman and Superman and them. It's the same thing with Conan. He's got no. I mean, are there certain Marvel characters that he can play nice with? Sure. But I don't need to see him, palling around with, Iron Man.
That's
That just doesn't work for me. I'll explain it like this. Growing up reading Conan, Howard created a world that seemed like it was real to me. Conan seemed like he was a real historical figure to me. And so when you take him out of that context, when you shoe in these obviously fictional characters that I love, but yet, it's like sticking George Washington in a story, or something like that. It just doesn't feel right.
Well, it skews the dynamic of the character and their history and the possibilities of their future.
right.
I think anytime you take a character and you put them in an environment that's unusual or not where the continuity of that character has been built, I think you run the risk of diluting how important that character is or the difference that character can make. Does that make any sense?
I think so.
Yeah, you take Conan. If you take him out of the Hyborian age, I mean, he's just a strong guy.
Yeah.
Conan could be the strongest, most powerful man in his time in Aquilonia, wherever he is at the moment. But you put Conan in modern society, what is Conan to Thor? I mean, let's be realistic here. Thor's a god. Conan is a super tough barbarian. So all of a sudden, Conan's not so special.
Right.
So
He's like Thundar the Barbarian.
Thundar had a star sword. Come on now.
I know, that was... All right, you guys want to wrap this up then? You guys got any last things to say here?
Certainly. Check out the Countdown to Conan at Paint Monk's Library, starting again today.
Nice.
And we look forward to seeing all you there. We will have some giveaways
Cool.
that we'd like to announce here, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever you want to plug.
We haven't figured out the dynamic of it yet, but I've got 5 issues of the giant-sized Conan from the 70s. I think Conan number 3 to number 7. Those are going to be prizes that I'm giving out for people getting involved, interacting with our blog, interacting on Facebook. Whether it's going to be every month or every couple weeks for the first few months of the blog coming back with the countdown, we will be giving those to people who engage with the pages. So details forthcoming, but there's a great chance to, just for being online and chit-chatting, to get some great vintage Conan.
That's cool.
Wanted to mention his writing.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention here, Bob, too, if you'd like to talk a little bit about what you do. We're blessed to have you and the rest of the crew on board the blog, and I had mentioned that you were an author to Keith.
Yes. I've got 3 published novels out there. They're in the occult detective genre. So if you enjoy supernatural fiction, you can find my books on Amazon. Just do a search for Bob Freeman. You can go to my author's page and you'll find my works there.
Okay.
Now, you actually work within the occult industry yourself, right?
The comic book industry?
No, you're.
The occult.
Or, oh, yeah, well, yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm a bit of an occult detective myself. I run, I do ghost tours, take people out to haunted locations.
Cool.
I give lectures on the paranormal, that kind of stuff. So I've been doing that since the mid '80s. So
Very nice.
Cool.
So do any factual things occur in your novels from your experiences?
Yeah, I use my own experiences and I kind of put a little bit of a Doctor Strange edge on them, so I kind of amp them up a little bit for a dramatic effect. But yeah, a lot of the stories in there, all the places are real in my stories. So like you could read them like a map and tour around Indiana and go to these actual locations. So yeah, I just dress them up a little bit. I mean, I grew up on Marvel Comics, so I know how to do the Stan Lee trick, just to make things larger than life. But
Cool.
And what are the titles of your books?
let's see. The first novel was Shadows over Somerset. It's about vampires and werewolves and witches and such. And then there was a follow-up novel to that called Keepers of the Dead. And then I have another occult detective series with a novel called Descendant. And there's a short story collection that goes along with that as well called Firstborn.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, once again, thank you, Joseph and Bob. Thank you both for all you do for Paint Monk's Library. And Keith, thank you so much for having the Paint Monk blogger crew on your Conan podcast. We appreciate that.
Yeah, this is really cool. I'm really glad you guys came along this time. Yeah.
Oh, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Inviting me.
Take care, Bob. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Bob.
All right, we'll talk soon.
All right, we will talk soon, sir.
All right, everybody.
All right.
Check out weirdedwonder.com. Check out
Paint Monk's Library at well, just Google Paint Monk's Library, and it's the first thing that pops up.
I'll put it on the screen too. So, all right, everybody. We'll see you next time.
All right, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
Good night.